Hi, this is Elyse Pegler. I am the co-lead of the IDD Advocate Corps, which is proudly coordinated by the Institute for Exceptional Care. On today's tutorial, we are going to talk about charter development. The IDD Advocate Corps committee and work groups are going to be expected to have their own charters. And why are we talking about charters? Why is this important? We think about charters as a way to lay out the committee or work group rules of the road. So the charter is a great place to document the purpose, the structure, the mission, the objectives, the responsibilities, the plans for the activities of the committee or the work group, and the resources that are needed to do the work. The IDD Advocate Corps overall has an overarching charter which we can run through in the appendix, which it's important for all of the committee and work group co-leaders to know and be familiar with. But what we're going to mainly focus today's discussion about is how to help you all, the committee co-leads, develop your own charter for each of your committees and work groups. So this is the sample charter that we would like for all of the co-leads to use. And I think about charters as the who, what, when, where, why, how, laying all of those rules of the road out. So we would like for each of the co-leads to start with a draft of a sample of this charter for your committee or work group, and then work in a collaborative way with all of the members, the IDD Advocate Corps members of your committee and work group to fully flesh it out. So we would start with obviously either the sector or committee name, the co-leads, the member names, the meeting frequency. You can also put here if you've already gone ahead and set up a standing Zoom, you can put that here in the meeting frequency. That's again that who, when, where. And then in the background section, we really want you to explain the scope of either your sector or your committee. And for all of the committees, you can certainly refer back to all of the training materials that we've done that provide those overviews of the scope and what each committee is about. And for the work group, we have a little bit of that for that first work group. But as we grow and develop additional work groups, we will want to really think about and brainstorm and have the co-leads think about and brainstorm what would go into that scope. And what's important is not just what's in scope, but also what's out of scope. So an example there is for the policy committee. We have pretty clear guardrails around what is considered policy and education and kind of small a advocacy as opposed to big A advocacy in more of the lobbying sense. That's not permitted under the IEC 501c3 laws, but the other kinds of advocacy around comment letters and working to educate any kind of other organizations or policymakers, that does fall in the scope. So this is a good place to document that. We also want to summarize the work group membership. So if we have a range of participants who have different experiences within healthcare, how many self-advocates we have, and caregivers and partners and healthcare professionals. We also want this to be a good place to detail those norms and operations and policies for the work group or the committee. Again, we have the IEC group meeting norms, and we have where when we've reviewed these before, the voice of self-advocates is primary, where we speak without jargon, where no question is a silly question, etc. But it's also, I think, helpful to lay out, uh, maybe, are we going to be continuing to meet, virtually? We already talked about meeting frequency in that first section up above, but are there other kinds of norms or expectations? So another example is that we really try to emphasize, it's an important value of the IDD Advocate Corps, that all information is accessible. So this would be a good place to put that into the group norms, that you're going to send agendas in advance. You're going to send slide materials in advance. You're going to send meeting summaries afterwards, that kind of thing. So people know what to expect, and how they engage with the work group or the committee. We also want to identify if there are any other stakeholders that can be helpful in reaching the overarching goals of the IDD Advocate Corps. So are there other advocacy groups? Are there organizations? Are there partnerships that might be helpful? The next section is the mission and objectives. So what we want to have here is, again, real crystal clarity around the mission, values, and the vision. And again, we have that overall for the IDD Advocate Corps in general, but we want for each sector, work group, or committee to really think about how those overarching mission, values, and vision, how they drill down into your specific sector or work group or committee. And what that could mean is, let's take an example of the health systems work group, our very first work group. When we talk about our values of patient-centered care and nothing about us without us and self-determination, what does that mean specifically for the health systems sector? When we talk about clinical care settings and we say patient-centeredness, what specifically, how does that look in a clinical care setting? And it could be, that you want to lay out here, that patient-centeredness means asking the patients what they think, what they believe. Self-determination means, in a clinical care setting, it could mean that they have the ultimate decision over the treatment that is being suggested, et cetera. I'm making this up because the whole point is for the co-leads, together with the entire work group membership, you all should be setting this. You guys should be determining what are those sector-specific mission, values, and visions. Then in this section, we also want to be really clear about the activities that are relevant and within this scope. As we've said many, many times, we do not want the IDD Advocate Corps to be theoretical. We want it to be concrete. We want to think about very specific activities, specific goals, our specific strategy. So we'll talk about measurable goals in a moment, because we have a framework that can help you think about how to set measurable goals. But we believe very strongly that setting measurable goals with a timeline can help advance the work of each of the committees and the work groups. And it also will help us and the whole leadership team as we seek any additional grant funding or are trying to meet milestones. By having those measurable goals within each work group and committee's charter, we can then aggregate all of those and think about how we are, again, advancing the mission of the IDD Advocate Corps overall. We also want to lay out here what resources and materials would be helpful and who is responsible for certain tasks. And then the last section is again that how are we going to be successful? So do we need additional funding? And what would that be? What resources are currently available? And what are the gaps? What might we need? That will be really helpful, for example, for the Research and Learning Committee to be able to look at this charter and say, oh, this is what their set of activities are. This is their area of focus. We need to go help them develop or find resources that can help them. And same with training. So this framework of SMARTY goals is helpful for setting those measurable goals. So SMARTY is an acronym, and you can see it stands for strategic, measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. So when you're thinking about the goals, those measurable goals for your charter, you want to be, again, strategic to think about the importance of what we want to accomplish and how that relates to how that specific goal, those specific activities relate to advancing the mission of your work group and committee, and ultimately the mission of the IDD Advocate Corps overall. But again, we want to make sure that it's specific enough to be measurable. We want to be able to say, we have done X number of activities. We have impacted, whatever legislation. We have recruited this number of members. Some of those goals might be sort of process measures. Some of them might be outcomes measures. It will depend. It will depend on what the committee goals and scope or work group. But so, an example of measurable goal that we already have in place for the communications and social committee is that we want to have, for our story bank, we want to have stories on half of the IDD Advocate Corps members by the end of the year. So that is time bound, it's measurable, it's strategic in that it ladders up to our mission, which is telling the stories and voicing the lived experience of our self-advocates. It's ambitious in that it's a bit of a stretch goal, but it's also realistic because we know that this is one of the key priorities of that committee. And so they are going to, when they think about the resources that they need, they're going to be thinking about how do we achieve that goal of 50% of the IDD Advocate Corps members having a story in our story bank. And again, that time-bound piece. And then the inclusive and equitable, I love these because I had always heard of SMART goals previously. And so I love the SMARTY framework because these are so important. The idea that we don't just set them in a vacuum, or we're not in just, again, this theoretical thing. We have to and make sure that all of the members are involved in that goal setting and that everyone understands their roles for reaching those goals, and that there are plans in place to ensure that all of the diverse perspectives and the people with lived experience are part of developing the processes and the activities and the decision making. And we always want to make sure that we are thinking about equity, because that is what so much of what is so foundational to everything that we do. So the inclusive part is why, again, we want to make sure that the co-leads for the committees or the work group are starting the draft. And so a draft kind of quote unquote straw man. So that's what we would like for each of the co-leads, the leadership team in May, to start this straw man. And then in June, July, August, as each of the work groups and committees are having their kickoff calls, this is where that I and the Smarty comes into place, is that we really want the entire work group or committee to be part of the charter development and refinement. And so it's helpful to have a starting place. That's why we want the co-leads to start with a quote unquote straw man, because it's hard to work off of a blank page. But ultimately, the work of developing the charter will happen within the full committees or work groups. So what we would like to do again in the May timeframe is have the co-leads draft the straw man, share it with myself and Madeline and Lauren on the IEC team, so that we can kind of look across all of the committees and the work group to make sure that there's directional alignment, that everything is in concert with the overarching IDD Advocate Corps values, mission, objectives, etc. Then in June, July, and August, we're expecting you to hold your kickoff meetings with your committees and the work groups. And we would like for you to share that straw man charter and then do that work to get everyone's input and make sure that it's a real super collaborative process. Then once you have completed the charter for each of your groups, your work group or your committees, share that with the governance committee for final review and approval. And the governance committee already knows, and they are all teed up to do this charter review when we get them. And then once everything is reviewed and approved and buttoned up, we want everyone to post those final approved charters in your committee or work group's Google Drive folder for full transparency, and use the charters regularly to make sure that you are living and abiding by everything that you've laid out, the measurable goals, the plans, activities, the responsibilities, etc. So here are some additional resources to get started. You'll have access to, on the IDD Advocate Corps Google site, you'll have this tutorial, the slides, others. Feel free to look back on our other leadership training recordings, and you'll have access to that overarching IDD Advocate Corps charter. And then within the Google Drive, that's where there are folders for each committee and work group. And you'll see there are templates there for meetings there and for the charter. There's again, that overarching charter. There's the Smarty goals that we just reviewed. So it's all there for you. And then feel free to reach out to, again, myself and the IEC team and the governance committee if you have questions, and we will also provide that review and feedback to make sure that there is that consistency across the committees. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but again, this is that overarching IDD Advocate Corps charter. Just want to make sure you are aware of what's in it. Now, it's more detailed and more specific than the charters we're expecting for each of the committees and the work groups. So just to remind everybody of that, this is way, way more detailed than what we're expecting. It's also a little bit of a different flavor because the scope is different. So we have a purpose, we have our mission and goals, we have our objectives. And so again, you can see here are our goals that are measurable. So at least 200 Advocate Corps members trained and prepared to act. At least 25% of the organization, meet the goals established for that sector, et cetera. And then we do have additional information here, our definition of IDD. Again, that's not as relevant for each of the committees, but it does govern all of it. Same with this, which is our membership and governance structure. So again, these are the different roles, responsibilities of the committees, of the teams. We also have membership criteria here. So again, this is criteria for the overarching IDD Advocate Corps. And I don't think we would really want to put any kind of membership criteria restrictions into the specific work group charters. But this is also really important to emphasize to everybody, and that we keep living our values. And, part of that is that our expectations of memberships are that advocates will engage with individuals with IDD as equal partners and respect valuable perspectives and opinions rooted in that lived experience. We respect the values and follow the group norms to participate. Willingness to work within the system, respect for the preferences of people with IDD, and then hopefully everybody has absolutely signed the volunteer compact and all of that. This is another one, our values, where again, you don't need to lay these out specifically in your committee and work group charters, but this is when I say about kind of laddering up and making sure that all of the committee and work group values for your specific scope relate to the overarching IDD Advocate Corps values. This is what we mean. So again, it's not that we expect you to take this table and just plop it right into your own charter, but we are expecting everybody as leaders to be really familiar and comfortable with the IDD Advocate Corps overarching values, and then think about how specific values or specific aspects of these values relate to your committee or work group scope. As I mentioned before, the group norms and guidelines, we expect every meeting, every communication to abide by these group norms and guidelines. We also have some, again, guardrails and information about the volunteer compact, which is probably less relevant for the individual committee work groups, because these are more, again, in general, and this is for everybody. We expect everybody to act with integrity. We expect everybody to notify us of any kind of conflicts of interest, etc. We also have a little bit more information about kind of our operating procedures, and the conflict resolution and the decision making. Those are important, again, for the committee and work group leaders to know and become really familiar with. But you don't necessarily have to put these into your specific charters. We just want these two sections to govern the IDD Advocate Corps overall. So conflict resolution, this is really important to be civil. And again, it's that group norms, those expectations, respecting other people's opinions. And if there is a controversial issue and there are different perspectives, then we want to make sure that the committees or the work groups immediately bring those to the policy committee, and the policy committee will really help develop the nuances and think about the specific stance. So even if that does come up in another work group, an issue that is happening in the community or in policy, we do have that process to escalate it. The other thing that is really important, again, just to know is how we want, when we say that we want collaboration, when we say we want inclusiveness in the goal setting or what have you, what do we mean by that? One of the tools that we've been using so far, which I think is phenomenal, is consensus voting. And the idea is that everyone has an equal voice. Everyone will be listened to and will be treated with respect. And the fundamental premise is that if the group can't come to a consensus, then we keep discussing until everyone feels comfortable with it. And so the voting is, one option is, yeah, I like that proposal, or I like that activity, or yep, that goal, that sounds good to me. Or, you know what, I don't really have an opinion about it. Okay, just, go ahead with or without me kind of thing. And then, you know what, I'm not comfortable with what we're discussing, what we're voting on. So, but then there are two kind of flavors of that. Well, maybe you might be okay with proceeding if others think it's the best option. And then the last one is, I'm not okay with this. I'm really not comfortable. And then that allows us to reopen the discussion and understand what is causing the discomfort so that we can discuss more. So again, it's not something that needs to go into your specific charter, but these are the rules of the road of the overarching IDD Advocate Corps that as co-leaders, we want you to be really familiar and comfortable with. Again, we mentioned we've got the sector work groups, that's for the overarching. And then the last section of the overarching charter is the expected activities. And so again, this is where, and this is why we want each work group and each committee to come up with their own activities, and that's why that's such an important part of the individual charters, because we don't know what we don't know yet. We really need to break out into our groups. We need to have the right people on the call, the self-advocates, the partners, and the healthcare professionals, and get together to generate that sector-specific work, the activities, the metrics, etc. So that's the content that we have. Again, just want to make sure everyone feels comfortable that you've got the individual charters that we're working towards. It's good to be familiar with the overarching charter, but the most important task right now, the first next step, is drafting that straw man with your co-lead, and then setting up those first committee work groups and charter and committee meetings to work through the charter with the entire group. So with that, I will wrap it up. But again, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, and we're here to help. Thanks so much. Take care.